So we put away one of the chickens that we're going to eat tomorrow for dinner, as well as the potatoes and the carrots. And the transition into making stock and reserving some of the meat is that I spent time roasting these. I did 4 at one time, so we have plenty for other meals. These chickens weren't intended to be eaten tonight, they're intended to be eaten later. And at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm reserving the meat and saving the skin and bones to make stock with. So I'm just going to put the meat aside. And it's very simple to go through and just make sure the meat is in bite-sized pieces, since we're going to be using this in jambalaya. Whatever dish you would use the chicken in, you just have to think about the size that you'd like it in. And once the chicken is deboned, all of the skin, the bones, cartilage, anything like that, you can freeze if you want for later use if you can't make stock immediately. Sometimes it's actually really nice to save the carcass of 8 or more chickens and just make a huge pot of stock at one time. And you can do that just by freezing it. So go through, the process is a little messy, but one of the benefits of using whole chickens like this, these broilers, is that they're far less expensive than buying just chicken breast, just chicken thighs or legs. By buying a whole bird, you're getting 2 legs, 2 wings, 2 breasts, 2 thighs. It's far less expensive, and they don't have to be processed as much, so you get a discount on the cost. So you can see I've pretty much picked that clean, and then I'm going to just reserve the bones. You'll do that for the entire bird. Any of the meat that is left, again, you can freeze this for later use if you want, or you can go ahead right away and start making something else. But once you've made the stock, you can freeze it. The bones and skin can be frozen for later use to make stock with, and the meat can be preserved by freezing it as well for later use in other dishes. So there's nothing like doing your first series of food videos on a cauldron of boiling flesh, but this is where chicken stock comes from. I promise you it doesn't come from a carton at the store, and if you saw how those birds were treated in the process of making that stock, you wouldn't like it any better. This is a much, much better quality product when you're finished with it. What I did was, the other night, we had 2 chickens. We had one the original night. We had the second with the pepper and salt the second evening. The 2 other chickens were completely deboned, and the meat was frozen. I froze the carcasses that were left over, the skin, the bones, all of it was saved. That's what goes into the stock pot. All I've done is added those 4 chickens worth of bones and hot water. I've now turned on the stove because we're going to bring this to a boil. There's a difference between broth and stock. Broth is typically meat that's boiled in water to make a broth. Stock is the actual collagen. It's the skin, the bones. Stock tends to be thicker. It's more nutritionally dense. And it's the foundation for a lot of other dishes. Chicken stock, you cannot make good chicken soup without it. There are lots of other dishes that this can be used in. We're going to use it in jambalaya, but you could also use it in things like Mexican rice or arroz con pollo. Very, very good. Wonderful. Once the chicken stock is made, I'll show you how we're going to freeze this for later use. But right now, all we have is water and the chickens that are left, so the skin, the bones, everything. And what we got for ingredients here is some celery. There's no exact measurement on the vegetables. I say you can just play it by ear, but I had 3 ribs of celery there. You notice I just broke them up. I've probably got about 8 or so carrots that I'm going to add. And I've got about 3 onions. You'll notice that these still have the yellow on them. It's totally fine to use these. They actually add a little bit of color to the stock. I've just cut the ends off. So, all of this material that I've added to the pot is going to boil. It's going to come to a boil. I haven't added any salt to this. There's a little bit of salt in the carcasses themselves, but it's not going to be enough to really salt this stock. I don't salt mine. Whatever I use the chicken stock in, I salt that dish, and that way I don't have to worry about over-salting whatever the final product is that the stock goes into. What I am adding are just whole peppercorns. There's probably about 2 tablespoons here. I'm going to add those straight. When this is done, we wind up straining all of that material off to be thrown away for composting. The onions, the carrots, the celery will blend with the chicken in this pot to make the best chicken stock you have ever tasted, I promise. It is absolutely wonderful. When we are done, I'll show you what the finished product looks like. But all of the fats, the caramelized material that's on that chicken will make a wonderful golden yellow stock. If you wanted something that was a little more deep in flavor, had a little bit more depth, I could have taken all the bones and put them on a sheet pan and roasted them again in the oven. You caramelize more of the material and then you make the stock. I'm going to skip that step for this. It's not necessary, just something you could do depending on what you're going to use the stock for. Chickens at the store, the ones that I purchased, were actually around $5–6 per bird. That means that I made $24 worth of chicken. Very, very inexpensive. I'm also getting chicken stock, which how much are a handful of carrots, some onions, some celery. Making the stock yourself from whole birds is much better. Also, the finished product, the jambalaya that we're working towards, to me tastes better when you have a mix of chicken meat in it. So it's not just chicken breast, it's not just chicken thigh, it's not just chicken wings. You're getting a more full spectrum flavor out of the jambalaya, which will be the finished product. The stock itself, nothing you're going to buy in the store will compare to this. And even if it did, it would cost 5 times more than I would want to pay. So, you bring this to a boil. When it comes to a boil, you turn it down to a simmer. You can let it cook for up to 3 to 4 hours. Then you turn the heat off, and we'll get it ready. So, I strained the chicken stock last night after turning it off. It cooked for about 3 hours in my case. You could probably go 4. Then you let the pot cool and strain off the material. I use a colander and then a fine wire mesh sieve so that I get a product that is just the liquid like this. And I'm now just reducing it. That just involves bringing it to a light boil, allowing the material to continue to reduce. And you'll notice that there's a little bit of some gunk that'll form around the top. We're going to skim that off with a spoon. I think it's just a mixture of fats, proteins that solidify as it's cooking. We're going to take the spoon and remove that. And once this is reduced by about half, we're going to turn the pot off. What that allows is the flavors to concentrate. We're removing water, we're reducing it by volume. If you think about a frozen concentrated orange juice, it's that same process. Once this is reduced, it makes it easier and has less volume, so you can freeze it. I'll show that process later. But once this is reduced by half, you turn it off, let it cool, and then you can put it in the fridge, the freezer for later use. So, this is with the fat and that skimmed off material we just showed. So when this sat and cooled before I turned it on, I also went through and just skimmed the fat. It sat overnight after being strained, so the solids were taken out. The spices, the celery, the carrots, everything was taken out. And once it's in here, I just let it sit overnight. When it sits, the fat rises to the surface, and I just use a ladle to gently skim off that top layer of fat. I think it's a little bit excess. It's not necessary for the food uses that I have for it, so I just skim it off and toss it, just like it did the stuff we skimmed off after it boiled down.
So this is probably going to sit for another hour, maybe an hour and a half before I turn it off and let it sit and cool. But you can see it's a wonderful golden color. This chicken stock is going to be great.